When did pain last destroy your peace? Was it last night, lying awake with thoughts spiraling like a storm? Was it that moment at work, pretending you were fine while silently breaking? Or maybe it's been years, and the numbness has simply replaced the screaming. If you've ever whispered, "I can't do this anymore," to yourself, you're not weak, you're not broken, but you might be missing something dangerously powerful. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal Viktor Frankl's most radical discovery about what suffering truly means. A revelation so controversial, it was born in a Nazi concentration camp and has since helped millions crawl out of their darkest nights. You're about to meet Elias, a 31-year-old man who thought he had lost everything: his job, his relationship, and worst of all, his will to try again. But through Frankl's lens, Elias didn't just survive. He found something deeper than hope. He found meaning, and that changed everything. You might think you've heard the phrase, "never give up," before, but what if I told you, giving up isn't the problem? What if the real danger lies in not knowing what you're even fighting for? Stay until the end, because I'll show you Viktor Frankl's most dangerous idea, that suffering itself is not your enemy, but your invitation to transformation. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to turn pain into purpose, not by escaping it, but by facing it the way few ever dare to. What I'm about to show you will forever change how you see the hidden parts of yourself reflected in other people. This isn't a motivational speech, it's a psychological awakening. Because the truth is, you don't need to escape the darkness, you need to find the light inside it. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, Viktor Frankl says. Elias sat on the edge of his bathtub at 3:17 a.m., staring at the faucet like it owed him an answer. His phone buzzed in the other room, but he didn't move. He wasn't avoiding anyone. The truth was simpler. He felt nothing. And that was the scariest part. A year ago, Elias was thriving. Good salary, a fiancé, a dream to launch his own design studio. Then the layoffs came. Then she left. Then, silence. And yet, if you asked him why he felt so hollow, he couldn't explain it. That's what made it all so maddening. Viktor Frankl observed that most people believe suffering is only meaningful if it can be avoided, overcome, or explained. That's the lie we're sold. You were taught that if you're in pain, it must mean something's wrong with you. That sadness, anxiety, or despair are glitches in your system, evidence that you've failed somehow, that suffering is a detour from life, not part of it. But Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, flipped this completely. He believed that pain wasn't the problem. Meaninglessness was. And that's where Elias was drowning. Not in grief, but in the terrifying belief that none of it mattered. Here's what most people never realize. Suffering without meaning becomes torture. But suffering with meaning, it becomes transformation. Now pause. Ask yourself, what if your pain isn't a dead end, but a signpost? Not a signal to give up, but an invitation to wake up? But here's where it gets dangerous. At the urging of a friend, Elias reluctantly attended a group therapy session. The facilitator opened with a question. What would happen if your pain had a purpose? Elias laughed out loud. The idea felt ridiculous, almost cruel. But then the man said something else. Sometimes the meaning of your life is not found in what you do. It's in how you endure. That phrase dug into Elias like a splinter. Why? Because it named the thing he couldn't admit, that his entire identity was based on what he could control, his job, his goals, his image. And now that those things were gone, he wasn't just lost. He was empty. Frankl would call this an existential vacuum, a space where you've been stripped of external meaning, and now you're face to face with the terrifying freedom of having to create your own. But I don't want to make meaning, Elias told himself. I want answers. I want justice. I want what I lost back. Sound familiar? If you've ever sat in silence begging the universe to make it make sense, you know what he felt. That restless, bone-deep ache of needing the pain to mean something. Anything. But Frankl's philosophy shows us something radical. It's not about waiting for life to give you meaning. It's about having the courage to give meaning to your suffering, even when it makes no sense, especially then. This is what makes Viktor Frankl's work so dangerous, because it demands something no one prepares you for: responsibility. Not for your pain, but for how you choose to respond to it. Most people spend their lives avoiding pain or trying to anesthetize it. Few ever look it in the eye and ask, "What are you here to teach me?" But Elias, he was starting to ask. And what he found next would shatter his view of what strength really means. But here's where it gets dangerous. Elias didn't just start to feel again. He began to see something deeply unsettling about the world around him. A truth Frankl hinted at, but few dare to face. Elias stood in line at the supermarket. It should have been a simple errand: eggs, bread, coffee. But as he watched the endless conveyor belt of faces, scrolling phones, distracted eyes, something hit him. Nobody looked alive. They looked occupied, but not present. He watched a couple argue about almond milk, a man in scrubs swipe through TikTok, a child scream while her mother stared into space. The world around him seemed full of people, trying not to feel. Viktor Frankl's most controversial insight was this: modern society does not prepare you to suffer. It teaches you to escape. Let that sink in. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When was the last time someone told you it's okay to be in pain? To feel lost? To grieve without needing a 5-step plan? We live in a culture that pathologizes discomfort. Feel anxious? Here's a pill. Feel lonely? Get a swipe. Feel stuck? Just manifest your way out. We're sold the idea that emotional struggle is a glitch in our system, something to be fixed or medicated, not explored. But Frankl, shaped by the horrors of Auschwitz, saw it differently. He saw suffering not as a detour, but as the crucible where the soul is forged. And yet, the world Elias lived in wasn't built for that kind of depth. It was built for convenience, speed, distraction, pattern. Interrupt. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you numb your pain, you don't just lose the suffering, you lose yourself, your intuition, your spiritual compass. That's what Elias began to notice. His own numbness wasn't random. It was trained into him. Every scroll, every binge watch, every meaningless hookup had been a quiet rebellion against feeling anything too real. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't weak. He was just following the blueprint. Frankl called this the existential vacuum, not just personal emptiness, but a collective hollowness that creeps in when life loses meaning, and we replace it with noise. Noise like endless content, toxic productivity, fake positivity, surface-level connection. Elias started to ask, what if the reason I feel nothing is because the world taught me that feeling is dangerous? He remembered something the group therapist said: numbness is not the absence of pain, it's the suppression of it. That line haunted him. It explained why he couldn't cry when he got laid off, why his breakup felt like a shrug, why even the happiest moments now felt like background noise. He wasn't moving forward, he was surviving. And that's when the mirror cracked. Our generation has learned to chase pleasure and avoid pain at all costs, the therapist continued. But we've forgotten how to find meaning in both. That was Frankl's battleground. He warned that if we don't confront suffering with purpose, we risk falling into what he called existential frustration. This isn't depression. It's deeper. It's a slow-burning erosion of the self, a subtle feeling that you're off track, even when everything looks fine on the surface. Sound familiar? Elias began to realize something sinister. Maybe it wasn't just that he had lost meaning. Maybe he had been trained to live without it. And if that's true, then reclaiming meaning isn't about success, or healing, or even happiness. It's about waking up in a world built to keep you asleep. But that realization brought another question. If everything he'd been taught about pain and success was hollow, what was real? But here's where it gets dangerous. As Elias peeled back the layers, he started to see how the system works, how society keeps us busy, distracted, and emotionally domesticated, all while feeding us a lie about what makes life worth living. What he uncovered next? It will shake everything you believe about suffering, happiness, and identity. Elias had stopped checking social media. It wasn't a detox, it was disgust. One night, he scrolled through his feed and realized something. Everyone was performing. Polished captions, filtered smiles, curated pain with hashtags like #healing or #never give up. But beneath the surface, no one was really saying anything. He looked at his own past posts and saw it. The way he'd pretended to be okay when he wasn't. The fake positivity. The silent screaming behind his "I'm fine." In Logotherapy, Viktor Frankl explained that the more people chase success, pleasure, and validation instead of meaning, the more they drift from their authentic self. That's when it clicked. Elias wasn't just lost. He had been trained to forget who he was. We live in a world that rewards performance, not presence, achievement, not awareness, image, not inner truth. And in chasing those rewards, we abandon the one thing Frankl said we must protect above all: our freedom to choose our response to suffering, not control, not escape, not revenge, response. That quiet, sacred space between "this happened" and "what do I do with it?" Frankl's logotherapy wasn't just about treating depression. It was about restoring existential agency, the power to decide that your life still has meaning, even when it looks meaningless from the outside. But here's where it gets dangerous. If you let the system define what matters, status, money, dopamine hits, you will slowly forget what actually makes you feel alive. And that's exactly what had happened to Elias. For years, he had measured his worth by output: clients, money, followers, sex. But now, stripped of all of it, he was finally able to ask, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I without the likes, the deadlines, the grind? The answer terrified him, because it wasn't clear. And in a world obsessed with certainty and control, not knowing who you are feels like death. But Frankl's psychology reveals a paradox. The moment you stop pretending to be someone is the first moment you can actually become someone real. That's why logotherapy doesn't focus on what you've lost. It focuses on what you're still free to do with what remains. Elias started small. He wrote a letter to his younger self. He went for long walks without music. He stopped lying when people asked, "How are you doing?" These weren't acts of healing. They were acts of rebellion. Because to feel anything real in a culture of numbness is revolutionary. Frankl wrote, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." So Elias asked himself a brutal question. If this pain never goes away, what would I need to believe to survive it anyway? That's when something cracked open. Not hope, not relief, but choice. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could choose to give it meaning. And that, according to Frankl, is where true freedom begins. Not in what you can control, but in how you respond to what you never asked for. This is the brutal genius of logotherapy. You are not a victim of your emotions. You are the architect of what they can become. But here's the part most people miss. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you start remembering who you are, you also begin to see how you've been manipulated to forget. What Elias realized next wasn't just about himself. It was about how the entire world conspires to keep you stuck in patterns you never chose. It started with a text from his ex. A simple, "Hey, just checking in." Elias stared at it for 10 minutes. He knew what it meant. Not love, not closure. Comfort. That old familiar comfort of slipping back into something broken, because it's easier than standing alone. And for a brief moment, he almost replied. Why? Because the past is seductive. Because the brain craves what it recognizes, even if it hurts. Viktor Frankl warned that without conscious meaning, we fall into unconscious repetition. Over and over again, we return to what wounds us, because it's familiar. This is the trap of the repeat pattern. You don't need to be in a concentration camp to understand existential despair. You just have to live the same empty loop every day and call it normal. Elias saw it everywhere now. Friends stuck in jobs they hated. Couples in toxic cycles, breaking up and making up on loop. People who numbed themselves with routines so they wouldn't have to feel what wasn't working. Frankl's philosophy shows that this isn't just emotional laziness, it's a spiritual crisis. You've probably felt it too. The moment you realize, this isn't life, this is survival. And yet, you stay. Not because you're weak, but because your suffering has become your identity. Pattern. Interrupt. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you get used to the pain, you stop believing in anything beyond it. You stop trying. You start saying things like, "This is just how I am." Some people aren't meant to be happy. At least it's better than being alone. That's not truth. That's trauma masquerading as realism. Elias saw it in himself. He was about to respond to that text, not because he wanted her back, but because pain was better than the void. Frankl called this Sunday neurosis, a feeling of emptiness that hits when distractions stop and you're left alone with yourself. Sound familiar? That ache you feel after the party ends, that quiet panic on vacation, that restless scrolling at midnight. It's your soul reminding you that you're still alive and begging you to find a deeper reason to be. Existentialism, at its core, isn't about despair. It's about reclaiming responsibility for your inner world, even when the outer one makes no sense. And that's what Elias was starting to do. He didn't reply to the text. Instead, he sat on the floor and wrote out every reason why he wanted to go back. Then, he lit the paper on fire. It wasn't dramatic. It was declaration. He was done repeating what had already proven empty. Frankl once said, Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. Elias finally understood. The question wasn't, why did this happen to me? The real question was, what is this suffering asking me to become? But here's where it gets dangerous. Once you stop blaming the world and start answering that question, you can't unsee the truth. You can't keep living the same life, and you sure as hell can't go back to who you were. What Elias discovered next? It required a decision most people never make, because the path to freedom always demands a cost. Elias didn't sleep the night he burned the letter. He sat at his kitchen table, lights off, only the glow of the street lamp pouring in through the blinds. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. Not at his ex, not at his boss, not even at the pain. He was angry that for so long he had accepted comfort as a substitute for truth. For years, he'd avoided discomfort by clinging to things that kept him small. He said yes to jobs he hated, stayed in relationships that were convenient, laughed at things he didn't find funny just to fit in. And it hit him. He had betrayed himself in the name of survival. Viktor Frankl's solution was radical. To break free from despair, you must accept the suffering and still choose meaning anyway. No waiting for it to feel better. No promises of clarity. No external permission. Just one terrifying step forward. With no guarantee except the one you give yourself. Never give up. Not on happiness, not on healing, but most of all, never give up on the belief that your life can still mean something. Elias started small. He took out a notebook and wrote down 3 things: a time he suffered, what he learned from it, how that pain made him stronger. That single exercise hit harder than months of numbing, because for the first time, he wasn't looking at his life through the lens of loss. He was looking at it through the lens of evolution. Pattern. Interrupt. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you start to give meaning to your pain, the people around you might not understand. They might call you dramatic, or intense, or too deep, because you've started speaking a language they're still afraid to learn. Elias noticed this almost immediately. His friends didn't want to hear about purpose. They wanted him to just move on, to have fun, to get drunk and pretend like nothing had changed. But something had. He had. Frankl believed that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. But that moment comes with a cost. You can no longer go back to living shallow. And so Elias made a terrifying decision. He quit the job that drained him. He blocked the ex who kept reappearing when it was convenient. He cut ties with people who mocked the work he was doing on himself. He wasn't becoming cold. He was becoming clear. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl tells the story of how prisoners survived not through strength, but through vision. A vision of something waiting for them after the horror. A child, a book, a cause. Elias began to ask, what's waiting for me on the other side of this pain? And that question kept him alive in moments of temptation. Temptation to numb, to quit, to slide back into the old identity. Because he understood now. The opposite of giving up isn't pushing harder. It's choosing something worth pushing for. Meaning isn't handed to you. It's built. With choices, with tears, with silence, with brutal honesty. That's the radical escape Frankl offered. You don't need to wait for the world to make sense. You only need to decide that you still matter, even when nothing else does. But here's where it gets dangerous. Now that Elias had chosen meaning, he had to live it. Every day, no matter what. And the moment you do that, the world will start testing your resolve in ways you never imagined. What came next would show Elias what real strength looks like. Not in theory, but in fire. Elias didn't wake up one day healed. There were no fireworks, no final tear that marked the end. Just one quiet morning, where he realized he no longer hated the silence. He poured his coffee, sat by the window, and breathed. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. He wasn't numb. He wasn't euphoric. He was simply awake. And that was everything. Viktor Frankl believed that those who choose to find meaning in their suffering become indestructible in spirit because they've gone through the fire and chosen to come out reborn. This wasn't the end of Elias's pain, but it was the end of his despair. He now had something that no one could take from him. A why. Not a career. Not a relationship. Not some vision board of perfect moments. A truth. Forged in darkness. Protected by choice. And burned into his bones. I am still here. And that matters. You see, Frankl's greatest gift wasn't just logotherapy or philosophy. It was a mirror held up to each of us, asking, will you let this break you or build you? Most people choose to break. They fold into bitterness. They build a personality around their pain and call it identity. But some, they choose fire. They choose to let pain shape them, not shatter them. That's what Elias did. And in doing so, he didn't become someone else. He became who he was always meant to be. But here's where it gets dangerous. Once you rise, you become a threat to everything around you that still sleeps. People will call you intense. They'll say you've changed. They'll resent your peace because it reminds them of their chaos. Elias lost some friends. He let go of family expectations. He walked away from circles where truth was unwelcome. But he never apologized again for wanting depth, for needing meaning, for refusing to numb. And that's the final test Frankl spoke of. Not surviving pain, but carrying the meaning forward into the world, without compromise. Elias started mentoring young creatives, not with cliches or positivity, but with presence. He didn't say, it'll get better. He said, it will hurt, but you're still free to choose what it means. He didn't teach strategies. He taught them how to sit with silence, to hold space for the ache, to meet themselves there and find their why. Because that's what this entire journey was about. Not escaping the darkness, not waiting for life to feel good, but becoming the kind of person who can walk through fire and still choose to love. That's what Viktor Frankl meant when he said, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Elias had chosen, and so can you. You can stay stuck in the patterns. You can keep chasing the numbness. Or you can choose the fire. You can choose to feel, to endure, to mean something. Now you have the same dangerous knowledge. What will you do with it? Elias didn't find himself. He built himself, one painful, honest, terrifying choice at a time. He stopped chasing happiness. He started building meaning. He stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what now? He no longer feared the silence. He respected it. Because in that silence, he learned how to live without running, how to feel without breaking, and how to suffer without losing himself. Now, you have the same dangerous knowledge. You know that pain is not your enemy. Comfort can be a prison, and survival is not the same as being alive. You know what Viktor Frankl knew. That meaning isn't something you wait for. It's something you choose. So choose. Today. Not when things feel better. Not when you've healed. Now. Because your why is forged in the fire, not after it. And if this hit you deep, if something cracked open while listening, don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because every week, we go deeper. Into the uncomfortable, the existential, the real. And you're not alone anymore. You're part of a tribe of people brave enough to look in the mirror and say, I will not let this break me. I will find meaning. I will become more. This is your call to rise, to feel, to endure, to live, to never give up, and never go numb again.